and good afternoon for those watching from Europe, Australia, and Latin America. I am Laura Velandia, and thank you for joining us today in news activity organized by INISEG about the Battle of Gallipoli and ACNC's participation in the World War I. I would like to take this opportunity to introduce to UINMA, the International University Foundation of Madrid, which brings together two major international higher education institutions, such as INISEG and AUCAL. UINMA brings together two important segments, and one on hand, INISEG as our partner in security and defense training, and on the other hand, AUCAL is a partner in training in the business sector. The foundation educates students and advances knowledge in areas of importance to states, the nation, and the world. UINMA is committed to being the premier national center for research and graduate and continued education at the institution of choice for graduating students of exceptional ability and promise. So for me, it's an honor to be here today. I am really happy to see so many people who are with us today, and also very excited for the great insights our remarkable panelists will share. And of course, please be sure to type any questions you have during the session into the chat box. We will be sure to address them during the Q&A session after the panel. So let me just take a minute to introduce our awesome speakers. First, and who will moderate the panel, we will have David de Calzal, who is the Director of the Security and Defense area of INISEG and the Director of the International Center for Advanced Research in Security and Defense of INISEG. He is a military historian, expert in international geostrategy and jihadist terrorism, membership research project in support of veterans of armed forces of United Kingdom, membership in support of the Association of the United States Army, analyzing international geostrategic and terrorism and homeland intelligence security in Israel. He collaborated as a military historian with the Vietnam Veterans of American and Veterans Foreign Wars. So I am pleased to introduce our moderate, David de Calzal. David, the audience is all yours.
Laura, por la introducción y presentación. Antes de darle el paso a nuestro ponente, al profesor Krajewicz, que nos hablará sobre la batalla de Gallipoli y la participación de las tropas de los ANZAC de Australia y Nueva Zelanda en la Primera Guerra Mundial, me gustaría hacer una pequeña introducción de 2 minutos de lo que nos va a hablar el profesor Krajewicz. En esta ponencia el profesor nos hablará sobre esos pormenores de esta batalla, las causas y consecuencias principalmente para Australia y Nueva Zelanda en la participación en el conflicto en términos generales. La batalla de Gallipoli, como bien sabemos, fue un conflicto y un conjunto de batallas militares en las que el antiguo imperio británico, apoyado por Francia, Australia y Nueva Zelanda, se enfrentaron directamente al imperio otomano y por ende al imperio alemán, aliado del imperio otomano, entre febrero de 1915 y enero de 1916, en el contexto de esa Primera Guerra Mundial por la ocupación de la península que le da nombre. La toma de estas suponía, evidentemente, tener el control del estrecho en el mar de Egeo y en el mar de Mármara, que evidentemente pues, conectaba la capital de Estambul, y a su vez con el Mar Negro y con el apoyo de los rusos. Aunque la ofensiva se impulsó verdaderamente por el interés británico por acabar con el imperio otomano, esta pues, evidentemente se planteó como lo que podríamos llamar medio de ayuda a su aliada Rusia, ¿no? Y ya que a partir de otoño de 1914 se había cerrado ya el estrecho del Bósforo y los Dardanelos al tráfico marítimo, lo que impedía, evidentemente, tanto para Francia como para Gran Bretaña, el poder suministrar armas a su aliado ruso. Ante esto, Winston Churchill, como primer lord del almirantazgo del Imperio Británico, se propuso una ofensiva el 19 de febrero de 1915, que apenas duraría algunas horas. No obstante, la operación naval no pilló por sorpresa a los turcos y fracasó en el primer intento, de forma que mientras las fortalezas y defensas artilleras otomanas quedaron prácticamente intactas por parte de la flota anglo-francesa, que se fue, digamos, a pique debido a las minas estratégicamente colocadas por los otomanos. Los anglo-franceses fueron incapaces de acercarse a la entrada de la embocadura. La campaña continuó hasta enero de 1916, aunque se tiene constancia de que en el propio 18 de marzo el entonces general Ian Hamilton, que era el jefe de las fuerzas expedicionarias del Mediterráneo, telegrafió a Londres advirtiéndoles a posible derrota. El desastroso intento de forzar el paso de los Dardanelos en 1915 supuso evidentemente una humillación para el imperio británico y un fracaso que pondría fin a la carrera del general Sir Ian Hamilton. Tras ello, la estrategia cambió y se pasó del bombardeo naval al desembarco de tropas, principalmente australianas y neozelandesas, y también con el apoyo de tropas británicas. De este modo, la contienda se reinició el 25 de abril y duró unos 9 meses aproximadamente, de manera que la primera ofensiva realmente estaba perdida desde el primer momento en que desembarcaron. Los aliados apenas pudieron avanzar unos kilómetros y al final de la batalla se convirtió en una guerra de trincheras, como veríamos en el frente occidental, sin sentido hasta que los aliados abandonaron dicha batalla. Esta ofensiva la podemos considerar uno de los hitos históricos más importantes de la identidad nacional de Australia, porque Australia irrumpe en la historia como un país independiente del Imperio Británico en 1901. Los 6 antiguos territorios coloniales que lo formaban seguían actuando por libre, pero la retirada de tropas también supuso el cese de Winston Churchill como primer lord del almirantazgo, aunque poco después, en 1917, volvería a la esfera política como ministro de municiones con el presidente David Lloyd George. Aunque podríamos decir que Gallipoli le perseguirá a Winston Churchill el resto de su carrera política, y él siempre defendió que había sido pues, una víctima de una conspiración política y que altos cargos de Gran Bretaña y de Francia no habían proporcionado las tropas necesarias y solicitadas para dicha operación en el ataque a Gallipoli. Y sin más preámbulos, después de esta contextualización histórica para entender un poco el contexto en el que nos vamos a mover en esta presentación y ponencia sobre la batalla de Gallipoli, enmarcada dentro del máster de Historia Militar de INISEG, con la que pues, vamos a dejar paso al profesor Craig Tibbets para que nos hable libremente de las causas y consecuencias de la batalla de Gallipoli en el frente de los Dardanelos durante la Primera Guerra Mundial. Laura, cuando quieras, muchas gracias.
Thank you for those opening words. Was really amazing introduction about that. From INISEG, we would say thank you for our speaker who will collaborate in this masterclass, and we are delighted to have you here in collaboration of the Australian War Memorial. During the masterclass, by our standing and collaborating an incredible speaker, Craig Tibbets, we will discuss about the Battle of Gallipoli. It was a series of military campaign in which a former British Empire, France and Australia and New Zealand directly confronted the Ottoman Empire and thus the German Empire between February 1915 and January 1916 in the context of the World War I. Remember that this offensive is considered one of the most important historical milestones of the Australian identity. And today we will relive history and also we analyze in depth the strategy, the approach, the troop movements, the consequences, in short, everything that happened in this key episode of the Battle of Gallipoli. So now, before we begin, let me remind you one thing. We will also give the space of all those who are participating in this event to ask the question, and the speaker will be glad to answer which one of them. So to begin, let's introduce our first speaker, Craig Tibbets. Craig has worked at the Memorial Science 2000 Initiative and Research Center, where he has a senior curator of the official and private records. During much of that time, he was also in chair of the administration and research for the Memorial Roads on Honor. Craig has studied the management of information, records, libraries, and archives at the University of Canberra. So let's welcome Craig Tibbets. Craig, it's so good to have you here today. And thank you so much for joining us. The audience is all yours to begin this interesting topic that took place in 1915.
Okay, thank you, Laura. I'll just share my screen and get the PowerPoint going. Okay, thank you, Laura. I'll just, all right. I'll thank you very much for the introduction, Laura, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people are tuning in from. In this presentation, I'm just going to cover the Australians and New Zealanders during the Gallipoli campaign in some basically an overview without going into too much detail. and then briefly, time permitting, talk about what happened after Gallipoli when they went to the Western Front and fought in France and Belgium. I'll focus a bit more on the Australians, as that's what I'm more familiar with, but I'll try and mention the New Zealand role as well, because that's the important part of the ANZACs, is the NZ, the New Zealanders. So firstly, how did Australia and New Zealand become involved? We're really dominions of the British Empire and very much felt part of the British Empire in 1914. And with the outbreak of war, both countries offered to send troops to aid Britain. Initially, an expeditionary force from both Australia and New Zealand of 20,000 men, and New Zealand about 6,000 to 8,000. As I've said in the dot point there, about twice that number volunteered, so there was a lot more than they thought would volunteer. So there was quite a task to organise and transport these men. They thought they'd be fighting on the Western Front in Europe, but with the entry of Turkey into the war, they were diverted to Egypt and did some of their training there. The Australians were all volunteers. The New Zealanders were initially all volunteers, and they later introduced conscription. So, as I mentioned, volunteers, men from a great variety of backgrounds, and some had limited peacetime military experience, but very, very few had experience of war at all. So it was really raising a new force of new soldiers, so that took quite a lot of effort and training. There's some very limited training in Australia, and then some more in Egypt, but really nothing prepared them for the true test of battle, which they would have when they went to Gallipoli. So the Australian Imperial Force and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force is what they were called. And when they were in Egypt, just before going to Gallipoli, they came up with the abbreviation or acronym ANZAC, Australian New Zealand Army Corps. So the Gallipoli campaign resulted from the entry of Turkey into the war. Russia was struggling at the time and asked for some support from the Western Entente, the Allies. And what they came up with was to try and force the Narrows. Where you see where that blue arrow is pointing, where the Gallipoli Peninsula and the Narrows of the Dardanelles Straits goes through to the Bosphorus Sea and then through to the Black Sea. So it was important, always has been an important avenue in the sea, in the Mediterranean. So the Allies sought to weaken the Central Powers by taking control of the Ottoman Strait and bring Constantinople, the Ottoman capital, under the guns of the Allied fleet and force them to surrender. They also looked to secure passage through the straits to Russia, to provide aid to Russia and also possibly to get grain supplies from Russia. The Allies were also looking for a way to break the stalemate of trench warfare that set in on the Western Front in France and Belgium, a way to circumvent it and open a new front with new possibilities for a pathway to victory. That's just a elevated image of the Gallipoli Peninsula and the straits running, the Narrows and the Ottoman Straits running to the right of the screen there. They initially tried to naval task force to send them up the straits, but of course the straits were heavily defended by Turkish forts and artillery on both sides, and also extensive minefields as well, sea mines. After bombarding the forts from early February, on the 18th of March, the Anglo-French fleet was led by 18 battleships supported by cruisers and destroyers, tried to force the straits and fight their way through. But the narrowest is only 1.6 kilometres wide, so not much room at all. But the minesweepers failed to clear the mines and fell back under heavy Ottoman artillery fire. Then a French battleship hit a mine and quickly sank, and then two more British vessels, one was sunk, one was damaged, and then another HMS Ocean disabled, and that eventually sank too. When two more French battleships were damaged, they ran onto mines. The ships were recalled. They thought they had come close, perhaps to overwhelming the Ottoman defences, but that was debatable for a while. But more recent research has proven that the Ottomans had plenty more firepower and ammunition to keep repelling the naval task force. So there was a change of plan. This is one of the things that really bugged the entire campaign, the naval and the land campaign, was poor planning overall and lack of clear goals throughout the entire campaign, really. So the plan was to land troops on the peninsula and capture it, and this is where the Australians come in. They formed a Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, which was initially just 5 divisions. There's a breakdown there of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, led by General Sir Ian Hamilton. So there's British divisions, 29th and Royal Naval Division, French Corps, which at that time was just a division, and then the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, supported by some Indian and Ceylon troops. But basically the main parts of it were the 1st Australian Division under Major General Bridges, and the New Zealand and Australian Division under Major General Godley. And there they are there, Birdwood in the centre and Godley and Bridges. So the Corps Commander in the centre and the 2 divisional commanders. Against them there was 6 divisions spread out all over the peninsula, probably spread out too thinly, but their defensive plan worked. The plan was to land British and French down at the bottom, the southwestern toe of the peninsula, and they would advance up the peninsula. The ANZAC, Australian and New Zealanders, to land further up the coast, where the narrowest point was, capture the heights there and advance across to occupy the centre part of the peninsula there and cut off any Ottoman reinforcements or any retreating from the Cape Helles front, the southern front. So the ANZACs went ashore on the 25th of April, just before dawn. It was around 4:30 a.m. While a little bit later the British and French landed down in the Cape Helles position. I managed to get ashore without too much problem up in the ANZAC position. And as far as terrain goes, this is a bit of an indication of what sort of terrain they faced. They had landed in a much tighter formation, not as spread out as they should have, and a little too far north of the main beaches that they intended to land on. So instead of open country, flat country, they were actually landed in a spot where there's quite steep hills and ridges and ravines right in front of them. So that was quite an obstacle. One of the things was, though, that by landing there they faced less opposition in this part of the coastline, whereas if they'd landed a bit further south, they would have come up against much harder defences and probably suffered more casualties. I guess that's debatable. There were 3 ridges that ran up from where they landed. The first ridge, which includes the Sphinx, which is that triangular feature there that's jutting up there. And then the second ridge runs from south of Lone Pine to the 400 Plateau, and it joins the first ridge just south of the feature called Baby 700. The third ridge, which was their first objective really, otherwise known as Gun Ridge, there's a lot of Ottoman batteries were positioned behind it eventually. That was their objective, was the third ridge. Some small parties of the Australians did actually make it to the third ridge, but there was only tiny amount of men actually made it, and they were soon captured or killed. So they eventually managed to hang on to at least to the second ridge, which is where they basically became stuck for months. So really a stalemate set in right from the very beginning. They were unable to break through beyond the third ridge and complete their objectives. Down in the south in Cape Helles, the British and the French managed to land in some places with heavy casualties and other places almost unopposed. But again, they've really failed to push forward and gain their objectives in the first day or so, and they also became stuck in a considerably larger area down at Cape Helles, whereas the Anzacs were stuck in a very small area, really only about, the beachhead was only about less than 1 kilometre in depth, and I think just under 3 kilometres in width, so very confined. They eventually had over 20,000 men there quite rapidly, but the Turks, the Ottomans, had the commanding heights all around them, so they were easily able to stop any moves. That's just an image there of some troops landing later in the day, mules from an artillery battery, and also men from, I think, the 4th Brigade coming ashore. Again, that's another image of the sort of terrain that they were faced. So very steep hills, ravines, gullies, a lot of scrub around it. So it was quite easy for the Ottomans to defend these areas, even though they were outnumbered quite quickly. But they managed to bring in a lot of reinforcements quite quickly and counter any sort of attempt that the Anzacs made to break out of that position. So, as I said, stalemate set in. Trench warfare, they started digging in tunnels, trenches, dugouts hacked into the hillsides, and positions terraced into the backside of the hills, and sniping and grenade or bomb fighting ensued for weeks, then going on into months. That's just another map there to show how small, well, the dotted lines, the dotted red lines show where they should have gone, what the plan was to break through onto the third ridge and then up the Sari Bear range and then beyond, but they were trapped on that fairly small beachhead indicated by the red line there. There's an image there of a position on the Anzac enclave, an example of where they sandbagged terraced dugouts into the reverse side of the hills so they could get some cover. There was really no safe place on the Anzac position because it was so small, and it was covered by Turkish snipers, machine guns, and artillery as well. So they had to dig in, and it was a very dangerous place. Nowhere safe to hide at all. In early May, there's the Second Battle of Krithia. This is down in where the British and French position is, down at the toe of the peninsula at Cape Helles. They tried another push called the Second Battle of Krithia to break through there, and actually sent New Zealand troops and also the Australian 2nd Infantry Brigade down there to help. It was about 5,000 men in all. They sailed them down the coast, and they participated in this battle here. They were attacking in broad daylight. the Allied forces had not properly identified the position of the enemy trenches or their lines of defence. And on 6th and the 7th of May, British and French troops made hardly any progress and suffered very heavy casualties. On the 8th of May, the New Zealanders relieved the British, and they made another attempt, which again failed with huge losses, again advancing over open ground in broad daylight. They tried again later that afternoon as part of a general advance across the entire line. The Australian 2nd Brigade, which was being held in reserve at the time under Brigadier General Mackay, was given just 35 minutes notice that they were to join the attack. So it was very disorganised. They had to rush up to the start line, and again, very unclear objectives and a lot of confusion. They suffered very heavy casualties in that too. So it was a bad one. All the attacks at Krithia were really bad. About 1/3 of the Allied soldiers who fought in the battle became casualties down there, and medical arrangements to care for such mass casualties, which was a bit of a feature, particularly throughout the early parts of the Gallipoli campaign. Medical arrangements were very inadequate. And these are the sorts of reasons why such frontal attacks, especially in broad daylight, failed. Ottoman machine guns, entrenched, and their artillery. Just artwork from the memorials collection showing Australian forces going forward at the Battle of Krithia. A few other things happened in May as well. Major General Bridges, who was the commander of the 1st Australian Division, was seriously wounded in the leg by a sniper, and 3 days later he died aboard a ship, a hospital ship. So the Australians lost their first commander there. Then in mid-May, Australian light horse and New Zealand mounted rifle troops began to arrive. Without their horses, they were to fight as infantry, just coming in as reinforcements. On the 19th of May, the Turks made a major counter-attack right across the Second Ridge with something like 40,000 men looking to dislodge the Australians and New Zealanders and throw them straight back into the sea. And there was wave after wave of Ottoman attackers came, but the Australians managed to hold them, Australians and New Zealanders managed to hold them, and inflicted very heavy casualties, some 10,000 apparently, possibly about 3,000 of those killed. The Australians' casualties were much lighter, only about 600, 160 being killed. And in places on the Second Ridge, some posts were very close to opposite enemy posts. Quinn's post was probably the most dangerous place on ANZAC. It was the key to the whole position. So there was a lot of intense fighting there, to the Ottomans trying to break through there and the Australians desperately trying to hold it. Because below it was the valley which led all the way to the sea, and an enemy breakthrough there could split the Australian position in half and allow a penetration all the way down to the sea. So there was always constant heavy fighting, sniping, bomb throwing going on there. By the summer, June and July, the stalemate had continued, but now came the summer heat. Troops became demoralised, physically, mentally exhausted. There's very little water on the peninsula. It had to largely be brought in, and the food was monotonous and in some cases not overly nutritious. What happened too with the summer heat, there's a lot of bodies lying around, a lot of men living in cramped, unsanitary conditions. There was a plague of flies, and that led to the outbreak of widespread disease such as dysentery and enteric fever. So a lot of men were evacuated sick, and quite a few died from disease, especially during the summer. So there was another attempt in August to finally break the stalemate. 5 fresh British divisions arrived, and they moved to capture a larger bridgehead around Suvla Bay, up to the north of the ANZAC position there. And the plan was to advance and capture the surrounding heights, namely the Sari Bair Range, above and beyond Battleship Hill, and peaks Chunuk Bair, Hill Q and Hill 971. If successful, an attempt to break out of the ANZAC beachhead altogether would follow. Allied troops were able to reach the heights and gain very brief footholds, Chunuk Bair, and the Gurkhas briefly held the summit of Hill 971, but they were unable to break through. Attempts to conduct diversions and break out of the ANZAC position by taking the hills to the north also proved pretty costly failures, with over 2,000 Australian casualties at Lone Pine, back in the original ANZAC position, and 765 killed in the attack on Sari Bair, and another 234 killed in a charge at the neck. These are just some images from the Australian attack at Lone Pine on the 6th of August. They had to, there was a ridge on the southeast end of the plateau, and a key position on the southern end of the ANZAC beachhead. It was called Lone Pine because there was a sole lone pine growing there at some stage. The Ottomans called it Bloody Ridge, actually, and they suffered very heavy casualties in that big attack back in 19th of May in that area. So the Australians attacked at Lone Pine on the 6th of August, an attack to cover the landings to the north at Suvla Bay. And after crossing no man's land, they broke into the Turkish trenches, and they found them roofed over with pine logs in many cases, and engaged in bitter hand-to-hand fighting that went on for days. They did capture it, but over 2,000 Australian casualties and 5,000 Ottoman casualties resulted. 7 Australians in... That's just another image of a diorama. It's at the Australian War Memorial, showing the Battle of Lone Pine. As you can see, what's depicted there is the Australians advancing to the Turkish trenches, which are have overhead cover with pine logs, which they had to get into. So it's fighting almost like in tunnels underneath there. Very nasty fighting. As I say here, Australian 1st Brigade, later with some battalions from the 2nd and 3rd Brigade came into assist as well. So it was an Australian victory, but little ground was gained and very high casualties. 7 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Australians at Lone Pine. This is Major General Leslie Morshead of the 2nd Battalion in the Lone Pine position, just after the fighting had finished. He would go on to command a battalion on the Western Front, and in the Second World War he was really Australia's best fighting general, most famously leading the 9th Division at Tobruk and El Alamein in 1941 and 1942. This artwork here depicts the light horse charge at the neck. The neck was a narrow saddle formed where Monash Valley pinches into the eastern end of Russell's Top, just below the hill called Baby 700. It was captured briefly by the Australian soldiers on the 25th of April, but they were quickly kicked off there. So the Anzac line formed just below the neck, and both sides faced each other across this narrow bridge of land, which is really only 30 metres wide. It was a very important position for the Ottomans to hold, as it protected the heights beyond it. So very important. The Australian light horse made an ill-fated bayonet attack there across the neck. There's 4 waves of men, each about 150 strong, charged the enemy lines. Again, in the early morning, they were certainly visible. One of the issues there was that there was confusion over what time the naval bombardment was supposed to cease. And there was a period of 7 minutes. They were supposed to attack right on the heels of the bombardment just ceasing, but there was a 7-minute wait, which meant that the Turks were ready and waiting for them and unhindered by any artillery fire. So of about 600 who charged, over half became casualties. 234 of them actually killed. New Zealand, actually I might just go back, leave that one there. New Zealand Infantry Brigade came within 500 metres of the peak at Chunuk Bair, which is up in the Surrey Bair Range. But by dawn on the 7th of August, they were not able to seize the summit until the following morning. They held out there for 2 days before being relieved, but then an Ottoman counterattack basically kicked any of our forces off Chunuk Bair. The Australians attacked at Hill 971, were really became lost in the approach marches to the hill and were unable to capture that position as well. And the final British attempt to resuscitate the offensive came towards the end of August on the 21st, the Battle of Scimitar Hill and Hill 60 as well. But after a week or so of futile attacks, they failed again. Then from mid-August into September, troops of the 2nd Australian Division began arriving on the peninsula as reinforcements. But again, with the failure of the August offensive to break through, stalemate set in again. On the 15th of October, Hamilton was sacked as commander of the expeditionary force and replaced by Sir Charles Munro, who it was his opinion that the campaign should be abandoned. Field Marshal Kitchener, as you can see depicted there on the left, he visited Gallipoli in mid-November, and he also recommended an evacuation and the campaign to be abandoned. As if things weren't bad enough, by October there was terrible storms and blizzards and cold. There's some pictures here from the ANZAC position showing it blanketed in snow at the end of November, and it caused the evacuation of thousands of troops due to exposure and frostbite, including about 3,000 Australians. So the British government ordered the withdrawal from Gallipoli, and between the 18th and 20th December, the ANZAC and Suvla positions were evacuated with virtually no casualties, evacuated during the night, and between 7th and 9th January the final withdrawal came from the Cape Helles position where the British and French were. So it was a very costly campaign. Total casualties for the Allies were 141,000, including nearly 44,000 dead. For Australia, 8,709 dead. New Zealand, 2,721. Plus, on top of that, there's those missing and died of disease, increases the Allied casualties. The Ottoman total casualties in dead were nearly 87,000, and many wounded died of disease as well. So it was a very costly campaign for both sides, and really the Allies achieved really nothing through it. And one of the pressing issues was that they never had a sufficiently large force to do the job. They didn't have the resources, especially at times, most of the time, ammunition, particularly artillery rounds. So there was a shortage of that, and all of these resources were needed more so on the Western Front in France and Belgium. So it was a poorly resourced campaign and completely failed its objectives. So, after Gallipoli, the ANZAC went back to Egypt and reformed. The Australian Imperial Force expanded to 5 divisions, and the New Zealanders formed the 1st New Zealand Division, or just called the New Zealand Division. And they were redeployed to the Western Front beginning of around May, June of 1916, up to northern France. And they were equipped eventually with a full complement of artillery and reinforced, made up their losses from Gallipoli with new recruits. The light horse who had fought on Gallipoli, they remained in the Middle East, and they participated in the Sinai-Palestine campaign, which ended the war up in Jordan and Syria with the capture of Damascus in 1918. So, the Anzacs on the Western Front. I'll try to be fairly brief with this, just depending on time how we go. So there were many veterans who had fought on Gallipoli, then went and fought in France and Belgium, bolstered by new recruits from Australia. Of course, on the Western Front, the firepower was much, much greater with artillery and machine guns like they'd never known before. It's just hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them ranged against them whenever they tried to attack. So again, after the learning experiences they'd had on Gallipoli, they had to relearn a new style of warfare, much more intense on the Western Front. And they became part of a much bigger organisation, much bigger than the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, the British Expeditionary Force. And as you can see there, that eventually grew from just 6 divisions in 1914 to around 60 divisions by the end of the war. The BEF had 5 armies, and each army had about 5 corps. There were 2 Australian and New Zealand corps. They were called 1st ANZAC and 2nd ANZAC. Now these corps changed the composition frequently, and each had either 2, 3 or 4 infantry divisions. And the Australian Imperial Force, as I said, in Egypt, they'd expanded to 4, and then another division joined them later, so they had 5 divisions. So each division had 3 infantry brigades for the Australians, and each brigade had 4 battalions, with a peak strength of 1,000 men. And then, of course, they were divided up into the battalions into companies, platoons, and sections. One of the first disastrous attacks they made was at the Battle of Fromelles, where they tried to capture the German line. It was really planned as a diversionary attack to draw German reserves away from the Somme front, where they were starting a major offensive. So British and Australian troops attacked here, but while they were able to break into the German lines, they were soon surrounded and suffered very, very heavy casualties, both in crossing no man's land and also where they were trapped in the German lines and during their retreat back to their own lines, having failed to break through. This is one of the costliest, in fact it was the costliest 24 hours in Australian military history, where the 5th Division, Australian 5th Division, suffered 5,500 casualties in really just 24 hours, which included almost 2,000 dead. So that was a really difficult and harsh lesson of what could happen on the Western Front for poorly planned and executed operations. These are some Australian soldiers in the trenches at Fromelles, and this is the sort of landscape course, in Gallipoli they'd been faced with very steep ridges and hills and ravines. Most of the land that they were fighting on in France and Belgium was pretty flat like that, and in the wet season could be very, very boggy as well. Just a map of the Somme battlefield between those two rivers, the Somme and the Ancre River. The Australians participated throughout the remainder of 1916 and 1917 on the Somme battlefield there, most notably the Battle of Pozières and Mouquet Farm. The offensive began on the 1st of July 1916, and after 2 weeks the British and French had made some progress, but heavy casualties had ensued and there was no breakthrough. On the 14th of July, part of the German second line of defence was captured, and one ANZAC corps was brought to extend the breach and make further progress in forcing the Germans to abandon this line. Pozières was a key high point on the ridge. If it could be captured, they'd be able to get behind it to Thiepval, another bastion in the German second line. And the attack commenced just after midnight on the 23rd of July with the 1st Division. They quickly overran the outpost trenches and captured the village. But enemy counter-attacks and intense bombardment caused over 5,000 casualties in just a few days. The 2nd Division was brought in to push forward and capture the enemy trench system on the heights, about 500 yards beyond the village. And after an ill-planned and hasty attempt on 29th of July, with very heavy losses, the 2nd Division was then succeeded by the 4th, succeeded on the 4th of August. Again, the German response was extremely heavy bombardment, and the 2nd Division suffered nearly 7,000 casualties on this occasion. The 4th Division was brought in. They just rotated. One got largely cut to pieces and the next division came in, as was the way with everyone on the Western Front. They were brought in to continue the push towards Mouquet Farm, which is about 1,600 metres northwest of Pozières. The problem was they were advancing into a narrow salient, which meant they could be fired on by from three sides. They attacked on the 6th of August, and after a week of gruelling battle, they reached the outskirts of Mouquet Farm. Another 4,600 casualties. So the 1st and 2nd Divisions were brought back in, and by the end of August they briefly held part of the village but were forced out. And this continued into early September, but the Australians weren't able to fully conquer the place. So on the Somme battlefield, Pozières and Mouquet Farm, between the 23rd of July and 5th September, so just over 6 weeks, the Australians had suffered 23,000 casualties. So just to show how much more intense the fighting was on the Western Front, and that was very severe casualties in such a short amount of time. Just a few images here from the Memorial's art collection, photographs and art collection, showing Australians, depicting Australians at this time on the Somme. Bombardment of Pozières. Just a completely devastated landscape. Some images of trenches. I'll just skip through those, just I'm conscious of time. Another, in 1917, early 1917, there was 2 attacks made at the village of Bullecourt, which was when the Germans retreated to the Hindenburg line. Bullecourt was a village that was incorporated into the Hindenburg line. There was 2 attacks made, one on the 11th of April, took place before dawn. The conditions were fairly heavy snow, and British tanks were supposed to support the Australians, but that plan didn't go very well. The tanks failed to really provide adequate resources, support I should say, and Australian 4th Division, they captured objectives, but they were soon outflanked and their retreat was cut off. The casualties at 1st Bullecourt again were pretty high, 3,300. The Australians were also involved in fighting at Bullecourt in early May, between the 3rd and 17th of May 1917. Very, very heavy fighting in the Hindenburg line there. Another 7,000 casualties for the Australian divisions that were fighting there. So combined, at the Battle of Bullecourt in just April and May, another 10,000 casualties. And this was having an effect really on the forces themselves, because as I mentioned at the beginning, they're an all-volunteer force, and while more recruits had been forthcoming in 1915 and 1916, towards the end of 1916 and then going to 1917, a lot of those, the volunteers were really drying up, so it was difficult to find enough replacements for the casualties in the Australian units. That's an image there of the first Battle of Bullecourt there, as I said, fought in snowy conditions, and the Hindenburg line was very heavily defended with barbed wire, machine guns, artillery. I think those are tanks. Can't remember where those that images were taken, but yes, as I mentioned, tanks didn't perform very well at the Battle of Bullecourt, but the Australians would work well with them later on in the war. The Battle of Messines was another one that the Australians were involved in 1917. The Australians and the New Zealanders fought there. This was the one in June 1917. The plan was to capture the Messines Ridge, just up in Flanders, just to the south of the Ypres salient. And both sides have been mining underneath each other's lines since 1915. So the three different corps of the British Expeditionary Force, including the 2nd ANZAC, which at that time included the 3rd and 4th Australian Divisions and the New Zealand Division and a British Division. Just after 3 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of June, there were 19 underground mines were detonated. It's thought that perhaps something like 10,000 German soldiers were killed in this initial blast. The Allied advance easily captured and occupied the ridge, and then over the next week they advanced further down the other side of the ridge until they captured the Oosterwern line. Despite being such a successful battle for the Allies, casualties were still heavy. Between the 7th and 14th of June 1917, there were 7,286 casualties. So, and this would continue into the 3rd Ypres campaign, the third Battle of Ypres. The Australian, all 5 Australian divisions were involved in that. Some familiar images. Cloth Hall at Ypres, devastated during the fighting. The Battle of Menin Road was the first one that the Australians were involved in. This is when conditions were still dry on the 20th of September. So the 1st and 2nd Australian Divisions advanced from West Hook Ridge. It was one of the step-by-step battles as they were described. 3 objective lines, massed artillery, barrage in support, and fighting against enemy strong points such as concrete pillboxes with machine guns and artillery support. Again, this was a successful battle for the Allies. The Australians captured their objectives, but again, 5,000 casualties. The next one was Polygon Wood, the next step battle. 4th and 5th Australian Divisions advanced another 1.5 kilometres. Conditions were still dry at this stage. By the 4th of October, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd Divisions and the New Zealand Divisions took part in the Battle of Broodseinde Ridge. And again, it was successful, but by this time it had started to rain, and from then on the wet weather really set in, and the whole place just turned to a vast morass, a bog, a marsh, call it what you will. again 6,500 casualties in each of these battles. Further fighting through up to approaching the village of Passchendaele in October saw further casualties for the Australians and New Zealanders. Particularly the New Zealanders suffered very heavy casualties in the approaches to Passchendaele. It was one of the worst casualty figures for the New Zealanders during the war was at Passchendaele. So the overall casualties for the 3 months offensive between Ypres and Passchendaele was approaching 500,000 men combined, the British and Germans. And for the Australians, I don't have the New Zealand figure, but for the Australians at 3rd Ypres it was 38,000 casualties. And 1917 was the worst year of the war for the Australians as far as casualties went. It's basically what the battlefield looked like once the wet season started. Just some more images from the War Memorial's collection of artworks and photographs. So the German Spring Offensive, the Australians were involved in helping to stop that offensive there, and most notably at Villa Bretonneau, just before Amiens, helping to stop the German offensive there in March going into April 1918. One thing that had occurred was that all 5 Australian divisions in November 1917 had formed the new Australian Corps, and it was initially commanded by Birdwood, who had commanded the ANZACs at Gallipoli, and he maintained that position on the Western Front. Then in June 1918, command was given to Lieutenant General Monash. So all 5 divisions there, part of the Australian Corps. The Australians took part in a series of battles, beginning with smaller ones such as Hamel on the 4th of July 1918, and then the Battle of Amiens, a much larger affair, beginning on the 8th of August 1918. Again, much more successful outcomes for the Australian troops, but even at the Battle of Amiens, after a week of fighting, the casualties were nearly 6,000. Another one, famously, was the Battle of Mont Saint-Quentin and Péronne. This was a German bastion on a bend in the Somme River. It was overlooking the hill, was overlooking the town of Péronne, which was a walled town with citadel. The Australians did an amazing job of capturing both positions, but again, very heavy casualties, just over 3,000. They then fought their way through to the Hindenburg Line in the final stages of the war. So by the time of the armistice, there's just some images there from some of the fighting during August through to October, November 1918. By this time the Australians they'd learned a lot, and they'd become very adept. They were very good on defence and also on the attack. They were very reliable, hard-fighting troops. But one of the problems was the size of the units being, again, as I mentioned before, being all volunteers and no conscript. The size of the divisions and the battalions and companies had shrunk, so they were very, very weak in numbers, which is why it's quite amazing that they achieved so much in their final 3 months of the war. Mont Saint-Quentin was that German strongpoint that they captured at the end of August, going into the 1st of September 1918. That's just some more artworks picturing them attacking Mont Saint-Quentin. You can attack on Peronne as well. As I said, a walled town with a citadel, which was a very, very hard nut to crack. Australian casualties in a barbed wire near Peronne there. And that's after they'd captured it. They're in the streets of the town itself. As you can see, pretty devastated. So by late September into early October, the Allies were advancing on multiple sectors of the Western Front, and the German army was beginning to collapse under the continuous blows of the Allied forces. There were mass surrenders, and the Germans were running out of men. The home front was also collapsing for them with food and fuel supplies, and morale was plummeting. Revolution also broke out among the Navy and then spread. The new German Republic was declared on the 9th of November. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to exile in Holland. The armistice, as we all know, was signed on the 11th of November 1918. So just to finish up, for Australia, the First World War, that was the human cost for Australia and New Zealand. So over 61,000 had died. And as I mentioned before, the Western Front was a far bigger story for the Australians than Gallipoli, even though Gallipoli became far more famous after the war for a very, very long time. Only in recent years as what the Australians suffered and achieved on the Western Front has gained more notoriety. But Gallipoli is still very much had been idolised and revelled in. So high casualties for countries with very small populations. As you can see there, nearly 17,000 New Zealanders died and well over 60,000 Australians. So probably out of time now, so I can wrap it up there. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Craig. And thank you very much for this amazing presentation. It was really interesting topic and it was inspiring for everyone. You're welcome. Thank you very much, Craig. So during the presentation, we received several questions in our private chat from the audience. There are different countries. So we will try to answer all of them. Of this question. But David, yep. What do you think if we start with the question that our participants have? David, ¿qué te parece si iniciamos con algunas de las preguntas que tiene nuestra audiencia?
Pues sí, tenemos algunas preguntas que nos han enviado los alumnos tras escuchar la excelente intervención del profesor Craig. Una de ellas es, pese a las afirmaciones de que la campaña de Gallipoli fue estratégicamente brillante y estuvo cerca de tener éxito, la realidad es que se desarrolló entre deliberaciones confusas, directrices cambiantes, objetivos poco meditados y una inadecuada distribución de recursos por parte de las fuerzas aliadas. ¿Crees que ese llamado tercer frente fue una estrategia mal concebida por parte de los aliados?
Yes, look, I think so. Look, it's one of those things where there was some merit in the grand strategy of trying to maintain communications with their eastern ally, Russia. There was, that makes sense to try and maintain those when other avenues of communications and supply with Russia had been cut off. I can see why they wanted to, because they needed to keep Russia in the war and stop them from collapsing. And I mean, it's one of those things to speculate about whether Russia had collapsed and been knocked out of the war in 1915. In some ways, the Allies, the Entente, were lucky that Russia survived and stayed in the war until early 1918. So there was some merit in the grand strategy, but I think ultimately they never had the resources. The Western Entente or Allies never had enough resources to properly mount these other fronts, the third front, in places such as the Dardanelles, Gallipoli, and then they also then later tried the Salonika front as well. But always not enough naval resources, not enough military men to put ashore, and always supplies and ammunition, because the Western Front needed all of those things more than any other fronts. So, yeah, I guess to answer the question, I think...
yeah, thank you very much. Great.
Yeah, I think it was they're not very well conceived, and the other thing was, yeah, apart from resources, ill planned as well.
Thank you, great. David, ¿qué te parece si seguimos con la siguiente pregunta que tiene la audiencia? Thank you, great.
Un poco larga, pero vamos a intentar resumirla. Mientras nos comenta uno de los alumnos, mientras que en el frente occidental fue testigo de una colisión entre superpotencias industrializadas, en los teatros de operaciones orientales, tanto el ejército otomano, que tuvo que sobreexplotar su base socioeconómica agraria para luchar contra un gigante industrial como Gran Bretaña, más de 100 años después, vemos que la mayoría de los interesados en la historia militar siguen desconociendo en gran medida el lado turco-otomano de ese formidable acontecimiento bélico, en el que intervinieron elementos propios de la guerra moderna, como ataques navales a tierra, defensas costeras con baterías de largo alcance, desembarcos anfibios, guerra de trincheras, bombardeos y reconocimientos aéreos. ¿Cómo logró el alto mando otomano restaurar su eficacia militar solo 2 años después de la catastrófica derrota de las guerras balcánicas de 1912 y 1913?
Yeah, very good question, and there really was a source of pride for the Ottomans. That they had actually defeated European powers at Gallipoli, France and Britain. I don't have a great deal of expertise in the development of the Ottoman army, between the Balkan Wars and the First World War. It's not really an area that I've studied in great depth. There are some good books around, I think, from John Erickson, which I have but haven't read yet. But there certainly were some... One of the things is that the British and the French really underestimated the strength of the Ottoman army and how capable they were. Now, it was pretty uneven. From what I do understand is that some parts of the Ottoman army were not very good at all, and they were not very well equipped or led. But some parts of the Ottoman army were highly effective and very well led. They had a lot of German equipment as well, particularly machine guns and increasingly artillery as well. And some of the commanders of within the Ottoman Fifth Army on Gallipoli performed very, very well indeed. Most notably, Mustafa Kemal, who was a divisional commander at the time. Now, he's an example of an outstanding military leader who managed to think on his feet and make a lot of the right moves to counter the Allied landings on Gallipoli with the 19th Division under his command. And as people would probably realise, not very many years after, he basically led became the president of the new Turkish Republic in 1923, which incidentally is about to mark its centenary later on this year, I think in October. So he was certainly became a very revered figure for his military capabilities, and there were others as well. Yes, but as I said, there were some very, very good elements of the Ottoman army that performed very, very well, fought very, very hard. How they did it, I'm not so sure. I don't really have that sort of expertise on the Ottoman army, really. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig, for this answer. Amazing answer, but a big question that we have right now.
Yes, yeah. That's a fascinating topic to study, really.
Yeah.
The Ottoman army hasn't been as well studied as other armies, for sure.
Exactly. David, tenemos otra pregunta de la audiencia.
preguntas más para contestar por parte de nuestro invitado, el profesor Krajewicz. La siguiente es, tras aceptar la recomendación hecha el 22 de marzo de 1915 por el teniente general Sir Ian Hamilton de que el ejército debía acometer una operación militar progresiva y prudente para que el paso de la Marina pues, tuviera éxito, comenzaron los preparativos para un asalto anfibio en la península de Gallipoli. ¿Crees que la estrategia de Hamilton fue la más acertada, utilizando el cuerpo de ejército australiano y neozelandés sin experiencia y sin instruir?
Another very good question and a good point made there. Really, as I outlined at the very beginning, the Australians and New Zealanders they were all volunteers, and they had not very much experience at all. They'd had very basic training in Australia and New Zealand and limited training. To ask such inexperienced troops to mount a full-blown amphibious assault on a foreign coastline opposed by the enemy in the dark and in very rugged terrain, it was a big ask for pretty inexperienced troops, for sure. Even if they'd managed to land more successfully, I mean, really, as soon as they landed, the plan came apart pretty quickly. Not only because of the different, the steep terrain that they were encountered with, also because predominantly because of the Ottoman defences. It was Ottoman opposition that stopped them, but also the plan really unravelled with the diversion of the 2nd Brigade, basically in the opposite direction, round to the right flank instead of where they'd planned to go, which is to go up and capture the heights up on the left flank of the landing. So, I guess Hamilton had to use what troops were available. As I said, the front in Gallipoli and the Mediterranean in general was always under-resourced. Those are the troops that they had available, so they had to use them. But yes, it was. I don't know about the strategy itself. I mean, that sometimes some historians have asked, well, why didn't they just land the entire Mediterranean expeditionary force all in one place, around the ANZAC position, instead of landing them right down at the bottom of the peninsula as well? Who knows whether that could have worked or not? I don't know. It's speculation. But very good question.
Yeah, I know. I know. We have a different, really good question for this masterclass. It's amazing to ask for the audience. So, David, tenemos otras cuantas preguntas adicionales.
Las dos últimas de esta noche. Los soldados australianos y neozelandeses libraron en Gallipoli su primera campaña importante en la Primera Guerra Mundial, como parte del cuerpo de ejército australiano y neozelandés. ¿Cómo fue la preparación que realizaron ambos países en los años previos a la guerra para desarrollar esos ejércitos y planificar sus fuerzas expedicionarias que participarían en esa primera campaña?
There was limited preparation. Both the Australians and New Zealanders had sent forces to South Africa for the Boer War in 1899 to 1901, so there was some knowledge and experience that had been gained there, but neither really, only had very small, both Australia and New Zealand, between the Boer War, in the 13 years up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, only had very small permanent military forces. So there's very limited experience there. The Australians, for example, had militia forces as well. So they had some military service, but really just limited peacetime service in militia units. But when it came to the outbreak of the First World War, as I said, both countries immediately offered to send the Australians, in the case of the Australians, 20,000 men, and they ended up with over 50,000 initially volunteered. So it was really quite a challenge for them to organise the recruitment and then the equipment and training. So it was pretty amazing that they did that in quite a short amount of time. But yeah, really the military preparations, the experience and training that was not really there. They really had to train them for war, starting from scratch with a lot of volunteers that, you know, some had never had any military training at all, mixed in with some men that had a bit of military training. So it was very, very challenging, and to be honest, really, you know, the Australian forces were, they had to learn a lot, and they learned a lot the hard way because of their inexperience. Firstly at Gallipoli, but in time, you know, they learned pretty quickly there, and then they had to learn again when they got to France and Belgium, a different style of warfare. You know, made some mistakes, some costly mistakes, but then they, you know, over the course of the war, they became very experienced and very capable, dependable troops. So, but yes, very limited development leading up to the First World War.
Okay, another question that complement this information is about, can it be considered a strategy victory and a tactical defeat for the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, well, there was limited preparation. Both the Australians and New Zealanders had sent forces to South Africa for the Boer War in 1899 to 1901. So there was some knowledge and experience that had been gained there. But neither really, only had very, very small, both Australia and New Zealand, between the Boer War, you know, in the 13 years up to the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, only had very, very small permanent military forces. So there's very limited experience there. The Australians, for example, had militia forces as well. So they had some military service, but really just limited peacetime service in militia units. But when it came to, you know, the outbreak of the First World War, as I said, both countries immediately offered to send the Australians, in the case of the Australians, as 20,000 men, and they ended up with over 50,000 initially volunteered. So it was really quite a challenge for them to organise the recruitment and then the equipment and training. So it was pretty amazing that they did that in quite a short amount of time. But yeah, really the military preparations, the experience and training that was not really there. They really had to train them for war, starting from scratch with a lot of volunteers that, you know, some had never had any military training at all, mixed in with some men that had a bit of military training. So it was very, very challenging, and to be honest, really, you know, the Australian forces were, they had to learn a lot, and they learned a lot the hard way because of their inexperience. Firstly at Gallipoli, but in time, you know, they learned pretty quickly there, and then they had to learn again when they got to France and Belgium, a different style of warfare. You know, made some mistakes, some costly mistakes, but then they, you know, over the course of the war, they became very experienced and very capable, dependable troops. So, but yes, very limited development leading up to the First World War.
Thank you, Craig. And we have other question for the audience. David, tienes una pregunta adicional también,
Sí.
¿cierto? Thank you, Craig. And we have other question for the...
Para esta masterclass de hoy, el alumno nos pedía esta pregunta que nos dice: la ofensiva de agosto de 1915 fue el mayor y más prolongado intento de romper el estancamiento que se creó en la península de Gallipoli tras los desembarcos aliados del 25 de abril. Una vez quedó claro, tras algunos de los combates más intensos de la campaña, que dicha ofensiva había fracasado, los aliados se verían obligados a aceptar que la empresa de los Dardanelos era ya inútil. ¿Crees que la retirada sin pérdidas de diciembre y enero del 16 sería el único éxito inapelable de toda la campaña de los Dardanelos?
Yeah. So as far as the Allies being forced to accept that the Dardanelles campaign was futile, it took them a long time to realise that, longer than it should have really. And yes, look, I guess because the campaign and all the offensives, the attacks and major offensives from April through to August were unsuccessful for the Allies. There was no success there. But yes, I think the withdrawal with virtually no losses in December 1915 and January 1916, I would say that they were successful because it's always, there's one thing to land on an enemy coast opposed with an amphibious operation. That's very, very difficult. But it's also pretty difficult and dangerous to withdraw from one as well. Again, if you're doing it at night time, there's always the chance that the enemy will attack you and just wipe you out when you're trying to withdraw down to the beaches and getting back on the boats. So there was a lot of preparations done for this successful withdrawal from Gallipoli. Techniques such as what they called silent stunts, where they would deliberately make no sound to get the Turks used to very, very little activity happening on successive nights, and also gradually thinning out the front lines and gradually having less and less men there, having them silently withdraw during night time, being as quiet as they possibly could, even at inventions such as the drip pan rifle as well, which people might have heard of, which is basically a rifle that's set up with two pans of water. One drips into the lower pan, and eventually when it gets heavy enough, the trigger is pulled. So it's like having a rifle firing when there's actually no man there. So eventually thinned out the lines and withdrew more and more men over successive nights. And during the day, they made it look like there was still plenty of activity there, and that sometimes they even made it look like there was more men coming in. So yes, that was very, very successful. There's always been a bit of debate also as to whether the Ottomans knew that they were withdrawing and just let them go. I think ultimately they must have known, the Ottomans must have known that they were withdrawing. They're not that stupid, or they're not that blind. And I think to some degree they just thought, well, why waste a whole lot of casualties attacking them? Just let them go.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
True. Yeah. And thank you very much for this answer. It was really amazing. Really, thank you for that. And excellent answers. We have more questions, I know, but due to the time constraint, we will forward answer to each person via email. And David, let you continue with a brief summary of today's masterclass. David, te cedo la palabra para dar un pequeño resumen de todo lo que vimos en esta masterclass.
Gracias, Laura. La verdad es que Craig nos ha analizado desde una perspectiva muy interesante la batalla de Gallipoli, una campaña que a veces muy desconocida también dentro del marco de la Primera Guerra Mundial, pero no menos importante como fue la campaña en Gallipoli. Tal y como él nos ha expuesto, hemos analizado una escalofriante cifra de más de 500.000 muertos, heridos y desaparecidos en la campaña por ambos bandos, tanto británicos, franceses, australianos y neozelandeses, y por la parte del imperio otomano, pero también un punto de inflexión y también de reflexión en la identidad nacional turca y australiana y en el cese de Winston Churchill como primer lord del almirantazgo británico. La campaña aliada, pues evidentemente tuvo unos objetivos muy claros, muy mal planeada, careció de la necesaria artillería, tuvo soldados bisoños, mapas incorrectos, escasa información, sus mandos pecaron de soberbia, no tuvieron el equipo adecuado para alcanzar los objetivos y las metas y evidentemente sufrieron deficiencias logísticas y tácticas en todos los ámbitos. La geografía tuvo también una notable influencia en la campaña. Si los aliados pues, carecieron de buenos mapas y de información adecuada y no pudieron tampoco aprovechar el terreno en su favor, los mandos otomanos sí que lo hicieron. Y merced a su control de la zona alta de la península, pues pudieron cercar al enemigo en las playas e impedir que penetrasen en ellas por parte de los australianos, neozelandeses y británicos. Las actividades submarinas británicas y francesas en el Mar de Mármara pues, fueron también uno de los aspectos más exitosos de la campaña, ya que pues, impidieron al enemigo utilizar el mar como medio de abastecimiento a la península. Para los turcos, Gallipoli fue un triunfo material que salvó su país y llevó a la fama a Kemal Atatürk, que llegaría a ser el presidente de la República Turca. Y para los británicos fue una de las operaciones militares peor concebidas y ejecutadas de toda su historia militar moderna. Desde INISEG les agradecemos la participación y colaboración en esta Masterclass al profesor Craig Tibbs del Australian War Memorial y, por supuesto, a todos los asistentes a esta nueva actividad académica del Máster de Historia Militar de INISEG. Muchas gracias, Laura.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. And thank you very much for this answer. It was really amazing. Really, thank you for that. And excellent answers. We have more questions, I know, but due to the time constraint, we will forward answer to each person via email. And David, let you continue with a brief summary of today's masterclass. David, te cedo la palabra para dar un pequeño resumen de todo lo que vimos en esta masterclass.